I think in every seed and every plant there are stories there. Right under our feet in the land there are stories. And this book, if anything, after you're done with it, I hope it inspires you to dig into those stories.
Today, it's a real pleasure for me to welcome Natasha Bowens-Blair, the author of this year's Ram Reed book, The Color of Food. And here is a beautiful copy of the cover, which shows you the color of food. Besides being the author of this fascinating book, you're a farmer who currently helps run the Native Mountain Farm in Boonesboro, Maryland, and a political activist whose advocacy focuses on food sovereignty and related social issues. At the heart of The Color of Food is some wonderful storytelling that honors, preserves, and amplifies first-person accounts of more than 65 North American farmers and food activists of color whom you met, interviewed, and photographed during your travels around the country. And I can't tell you how much the photographs mean to me. They're just beautiful. It brings their stories together in a larger, more complex narrative that is both enlightening and inspiring, while at the same time examines the obstacles and challenges that they and so many others have faced for so long. Thank you for being here, Natasha. The Color of Food seems to be about two journeys. Your own, as a woman of color moving from the world of advocacy in a Washington, D.C. office, to what you describe as someone barefoot in the mud, wondering where all the other brown folks were, who became deeply committed to a different agrarian way of life, and the literal journey you made across the country to talk with, learn about, and better understand the experiences of farmers of color in today's world. Can you talk about how the one journey, your personal journey, led you to the other, and how they became intertwined, leading to this amazing book?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to sit here in conversation with you. So yes, The Color of Food was definitely a journey that I was led on through my own personal journey, right? When I started farming, which came about a long journey through activism, really. I became really involved in environmental issues and health. I was lucky enough to be living in DC at the time of Obamacare, and I was an advocate for young people's health rights on that bill. And I just really found that my passion about the inequities in the environmental justice movement and also our health, there was just a big elephant in the room for me that I didn't feel was being talked about, at least in the circles that I was in at the time, and that was food. So I started to really look at our food system and educate myself on our broken food system, and I started asking more questions about what was in my food, and going to farmers markets and volunteering on urban farms and community gardens. And so I was really being called to start farming and to start growing my own food and digging my hands into the food system. But in that, I found myself in this space. As I said, here I am in the mud in West Virginia, farming, and wondering where other people like me were, and feeling like this space, asking this question of, is this space for me? There were plenty of other kind of back to the land hipsters at the time, picking up the pitchfork and just kind of joining this crunchy movement. But, I was wondering where other brown and black folks were. And so it really led me to start asking those questions and digging into that and trying to find that solidarity. And just very personally started allowing me to dig into my own ancestry and my own family's history with farming. You know, I didn't grow up on the farm. I was in South Florida in the metropolitan area of Fort Lauderdale, very far from the farm. But my roots, my family's roots are in South Carolina. And I hadn't really dug into my ancestry until the beginning of this book. And I visited Greenville, the town where both my father and mother are from, and started finding more information about my great-grandmother, who was born, you know, to a sharecropper, and just really tapping into the fact that when I dug my hands into the soil, I could feel that history there. You know, just the ritual of planting seeds and feeding ourselves. And it started bringing up all these complex questions. And I knew then that I had to get on the road and find other folks who also had these stories. And so as I got on the road, you know, my personal journey started to intertwine with these stories, and it just became a whole journey of storytelling and unearthing, you know, the history, the current issues, but also the resilience in being connected to the land and our food.
That's so powerful, and it really connects to one of the recurring themes in the portraits sections of the book, and that's the multi-generational aspect of so many of the stories you share, how the experiences and identities of today's farmers of color are really rooted in the experience of their parents and grandparents and those who came before them. Your own story has this powerful generational aspect that you've just shared with us. How does that influence your perspective on what other people of color are experiencing and the way it connects them back to their own ancestry?
Well, you know, it was even when we started chatting here this morning, you know, we're talking about food and medicine from the land, and the first story you shared was of your grandmother, right? Mm-hmm. And how she used to grow herbs, and those are your memories. Well, there's not one farmer that I met and spoke to that didn't have those stories, you know, that connected them to the land. And so even though I didn't grow up with the story of Lala, my great-grandmother, you know, once I tapped into that, it was just so powerful to know. It almost validated, you know, okay, I do belong here. And though there's some painful history there, you know, and so many, especially for African Americans in this country, so much pain and oppression that's tied in with the land. But there's also such beauty and such self-sufficiency in the fact that we were able to grow our own food and medicine, and we still held those skills and those cultural traditions of feeding ourselves and passing those stories along. And I think that our ancestors as being our teachers is something that we've lost, right? Mm-hmm. There's such a disconnect there. And so to be able to bring that back and to preserve that through storytelling is so powerful and so needed. And so I think it's the biggest thing that I learned from sitting at the feet of so many of these farmers, just holding on to our ancestors, as well as the plants and the teachings that they hold for us. So.
One of the most amazing things about your book, I think, and I said at the very beginning how much I enjoyed the photographs. It really helps me connect with who people are. But the storytelling is very powerful because it really touches not just the head, but the heart. And it really, I find the book very important in terms of the humanity of it and the connection. And you wrote about your own heritage, and you've just talked about that, and of a friend who reminded you that working in the fields was supposed to be a thing of the past for African American people because of the legacy of slavery. But ultimately, that didn't deter you. It connected you in a way. How did you reconcile your own story and the skepticism of friends with your growing interest and commitment to food and the farm movement?
Yeah, it's so interesting because when I started digging into this farm movement, at first I did feel like I was entering into someone else's space. And I felt, as my friend said, she she's from Jamaica, and she was just like, what are you going back out in the fields for? We walked away from that. So there was almost this, this pain speaking that almost did deter me and feel like, and when I found out about my great grandmother and, her growing up on sharecropping and then going on to work as a domestic, and, I did wonder, am I returning to something that she worked to free us of? Am I returning to this oppressive space? But then very instantly, as soon as I started tapping in and intuitively, digging into the soil, I just knew that, yes, there's pain there, but there's also there's something here that's bigger than that and more powerful than that. And as I started learning from these farmers, very instantly, it was just, this resounding no. This is what we need to be returning to. These are the stories and the strength and the wisdom and the resilience that lies here, is what we need to move forward and heal from that pain and know that we can connect to the land and then be able to create our own community food systems. And, one of the biggest things that a lot of these farmers are farming for, it's not just to create a farming business, and to create a farming career. It's farming for, resistance, for revolution, for liberation. So I think those lessons and finding out that communities of color are just farming for these different reasons is what was able to reconcile any of those questions for me and, in fact, empower me to move forward.
It's really powerful, and your epilogue actually serves as a call to action. For all of us to address the historical exploitation and continuing inequities that are obstacles for farmers of color, and to reclaim the agricultural legacy of their communities, and then work to achieve a sustainable and just future in food and agriculture. What are some concrete things we can do here in northern Colorado and anywhere someone might see this video to help make that vision a reality?
Yeah, that's a big question that I get all the time. And, the main thing I think is, number one, finding out what communities, are here and already doing this work, right? Like, and tapping in and trying to start building relationship with those communities and finding ways where you can support, not walking in and kind of with an agenda, but just going in and listening and finding out where you can support, whether it be with resources or donations. Land is a huge resource that obviously many farmers struggle to acquire. And so any resources that you can share, whether it be creating a platform where you can be raising awareness about these organizations, again, donating, sharing resources. But number two, I think it's very important to be doing the work within our communities to dig into these stories, to build understanding, to be unpacking our own, discriminatory and just unpacking our own issues, because we are all so ingrained with the lack of understanding of what goes on in communities. And, I think a phrase that I like to say is, to erase the margins, we have to go and stand in them, right? Like, we have to actually go and start to understand what's going on in these communities, and then go home into our own communities and be doing that education. And so I think those are the two biggest things that I would recommend. And being here at CSU with so many resources and such a platform to support, just doing that outreach in the community.
Well, thank you for that. It feels like, as a land-grant university and a presence throughout the state, we've got that infrastructure that we can use that could be so powerful to do exactly what you're saying. One of the places I went in the western part of the state this summer it's an ag experiment station, and it's also a Forest Service location, and it is extension. And what they had done was work with the Hopi, with the Ute community near them, and they built a ceremonial garden on the space. And it was really incredible to both, as you said, stand on the margin, but then be in there. And when you said, reaching out into communities, I think we actually can do a lot in Colorado. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. There are a number of places in your book where either you or one of the folks you talked to emphasize the value of sharing a meal. And one of our CSU professors, Michael Carolyn, has written a book called A Decent Meal. It emphasizes the importance of shared experiences and social encounters as a way to get people talking to one another about important and sometimes controversial issues. Basically, he's saying we ought to sit down, have a meal together with someone who sees the world through a different lens, through different experiences, through different perspectives, and try to discover where we might have common ground. Who would you like to sit down with for a meal like that, and what would you talk about?
Yeah, I love that question. And I just feel so grateful that I was able to sit with so many amazing farmers and elders that taught me so much. So, I couldn't have imagined being able to sit down with that many people and share so much and absorb so much knowledge. So I'm grateful that I already got to sit down with so many folks. But if I were able to sit down, to pull from the ancestors, I would want to sit down with my great-grandmother and just really hear more about her experience and then have her perspective of what's going on today and that guidance and maybe some other ancestors that aren't here anymore, some of the leaders of the food movement like Fannie Lou Hamer and just a lot of folks that have been doing this work for so long. Even the elders that I was able to sit down with just spoke about how they're still fighting the same issues that their parents and their grandparents, so this isn't, racism isn't new for this country, and a lot of these issues just keep repeating over and over again. And we've had such incredible leaders over the generations, and so it would be a dream to be able to sit down.
That's such a wonderful visual for me, you sitting down with your
Wouldn't that be
great-grandmother.
beautiful?
It would be amazing. Would you want to know what she grew?
Yes, I would want to know it all. Absolutely. Her memories as a child, running around on the farm, and yeah.
I have really visual memories of my grandmother in the garden. And one of the great memories for me is a fight that my aunt and uncle had at the farm table about the garden. And the fight was my uncle took credit for the garden and for all the food in the garden. And then my aunt got really angry and said, well, do you think the food walked itself to the table? Did it cook itself? No, I did. So there was
awesome.
this great sort of moment where they're on the one hand, they're celebrating this garden, which really was a legacy garden from my grandparents. On the other hand, they're fighting just like brothers and sisters about what they're doing with
But
the
what
garden.
a great teaching moment for you
It
to
was.
see, this woman standing up and saying, hello.
Hello. No, it really was very, very perfect.
That's great.
Well, it's just been wonderful to have you here today. I can't thank you enough. This book is very important, and the Rams Read is very important to this campus. It unifies every college here. There's something in here for every student, every college, every faculty member, and every staff member. And that is the perfect Rams Read, because we can all engage together and talk about our differences and our commonalities.
Well, that was the goal when I wrote the book, and I'm so grateful for such a program. When I went to school, I had never heard of a campus-wide reading program, so I think it's a phenomenal program, and I'm glad that I'm so honored that my book could be chosen. And if you don't mind, I wanted to share with you what Ryan Barone shared with me this morning. It was an email from a community member that found out about the book. Just from your promotion about the program, and she got the book, and her granddaughter, who I believe is under 2 years old.
Oh.
It sits on her coffee table, and she wrote the sweetest email to share that her granddaughter has really connected with the book, and every morning waves to the faces on the cover and opens it up and is asking questions, and they talk about each story, and she has some favorites like Daniel Whitaker, who is one of my favorites, and she's waving and giving kisses to these pictures, and that just made me cry this morning. And so I thought I'd share that with you.
It's beautiful.
Because of your program, it's reaching this community. And, she said also that the granddaughter was biracial, so she really felt like she was connecting with these faces. And that, to me, is all I could have ever dreamed for this book. And that's why I appreciate your comments on the photography and the storytelling, because for me, I really wanted the faces to be able to resonate and grab the attention of young people of color who, might be feeling lost and trying to find that place as I was. And so, yeah.
Oh, thank you so very much. I'm honored that you're here.